He thought he had it all: the multi-million-dollar deal, the corner office overlooking Manhattan, and the young, beautiful mistress on his arm. At the city's most exclusive VIP banquet, Jameson Varner was ready for his coronation. But he made one catastrophic miscalculation. He never imagined his ex-wife, the ordinary simple woman he'd discarded for being unambitious, would be there. And he certainly never imagined she'd walk in wearing the legendary Midnight Star, a $5,000 diamond necklace that could buy and sell his entire world. This isn't just a story of revenge. This is a story of a woman reclaiming her power and a man about to learn that the biggest assets are the ones you can't see. Jameson Varner surveyed the Grand Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art with the possessive air of a king viewing his domain. The annual St. Jude Benefactor's Ball was the apex of New York's social and financial food chain, a glittering sea of old money, new money, and the power brokers who swam between them. Chandeliers dripping with baccarat crystal cast a warm golden glow over the assembly. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, hummed with the low murmur of billion-dollar conversations. And tonight, Jameson felt like the apex predator. He adjusted the lapels of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, a subtle flex of midnight blue wool silk that cost more than the first car he'd ever owned. On his arm, clinging with a practiced blend of adoration and entitlement, was Tiffany Hayes. She was 24, a decade younger than his ex-wife, Amelia, and poured into a gaudy canary yellow Versace gown that screamed for attention. Her hair was a platinum blonde so bright it looked synthetic, and her laughter, a high-pitched tinkle, followed every one of his pronouncements, no matter how mundane. "Jameson, darling," she cooed, her crimson-nailed hand stroking his arm. "Is that Marcus Thorne over there? He looks absolutely green. I think he saw your feature in Forbes." Jameson glanced across the room. His chief rival, Marcus Thorne, a bulldog of a man who ran a competing private equity firm, was indeed staring daggers at him. Jameson had just closed the landmark acquisition of Aerosynth Technologies, a deal Marcus had been fighting tooth and nail for. The Forbes article titled "The New King of Wall Street" was just the cherry on top. "Let him look," Jameson said, a smirk playing on his lips. "That's the look of a man who's just been relegated to second place. Some people are born to lead Tiffany. Others are born to watch from the sidelines." Tiffany giggled, nuzzling against his shoulder. "You're so brilliant. Everyone here knows it." She wasn't wrong. Jameson had clawed his way to this summit with relentless ambition. He came from nothing, a scholarship kid who'd outworked and outmaneuvered every blue-blooded peer at Wharton. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. His company, Varner Capital, was his greatest asset. His ex-wife, Amelia, had become his greatest liability. He thought of Amelia now, a fleeting, dismissive image. Amelia, with her quiet intelligence, her love for dusty old books and obscure art history. She had been with him from the beginning, in the cramped one-bedroom apartment, when his firm was just a laptop and a mountain of debt. She'd proofread his business plans, made him coffee at 3 a.m., and celebrated his first million with a simple, home-cooked meal. But as his star rose, her quiet nature began to grate on him. He needed a woman who was a reflection of his success, a showpiece. Amelia hated these events. She'd wear a simple, elegant dress, nurse a single glass of wine, and have deep, meaningful conversations with one or two people instead of flitting around the room collecting contacts. She had a hobby, appraising antique jewelry, and art for small, independent clients. He found it quaint, a little pathetic. "It's good you have something to keep you busy," he'd once said, the condescension thick in his voice. The divorce had been swift and, on his end, merciless. He gave her what he considered a generous settlement, the modest suburban house they'd first bought, a lump sum he barely noticed, and enough alimony to live comfortably. He had been clear about his reasoning. "Amelia, we're on different paths now. My world requires a different kind of partner, someone who understands the game." She had simply looked at him, her grey eyes unreadable, and said, "I understand the game better than you think, Jameson." Then, she'd signed the papers without a fight. He took her silence as acquiescence, as an admission of her own inadequacy. He hadn't seen or heard from her in the 6 months since, and he assumed she was living her small, ordinary life somewhere in Connecticut, probably tending to her garden and appraising trinkets for pocket money. "Jameson, there you are." A booming voice broke his reverie. It was Robert Sterling, a board member of the hospital and a titan of industry. "Congratulations on the aerosynth deal. A masterstroke, my boy. A genuine masterstroke." Jameson's chest swelled. This was what he lived for. The recognition, the envy, the confirmation of his dominance. He shook Robert's hand firmly, accepting the praise as his due. He introduced Tiffany, who performed her role perfectly, batting her eyelashes and murmuring about how tirelessly Jameson worked. The room was his oyster. Every glance was a validation. Every whispered conversation that fell silent as he passed was a testament to his power. He was Jameson Varner, the man who had everything. It was then, at the absolute zenith of his self-satisfaction, that the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted. It wasn't a loud change, but a subtle rolling wave of silence that started near the grand entrance and spread through the crowd like a contagion. Conversations faltered, heads turned. A low collective gasp seemed to hang in the air, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Jameson, annoyed at the interruption to his moment, turned to see what was causing the commotion. His eyes followed the gazes of 100 of the world's most powerful people. They were all looking at one person, a woman. She stood framed in the magnificent archway, a vision of impossible grace. She wore a bespoke Schiaparelli gown of deep indigo silk that seemed to drink the light, its avant-garde, cut both classic and daring. Her auburn hair was swept up in a chignon that was a work of art in itself. She was poised, her posture serene, her expression calm as she surveyed the room. Jameson's blood ran cold. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. The glass of champagne in his hand felt suddenly heavy. It was Amelia, but it wasn't the Amelia he remembered. This wasn't the woman in sensible shoes and a library tote bag. This was a queen surveying her court. And then he saw it, the reason for the collective gasp. Resting in the hollow of her throat against the pale skin he once knew so well was a necklace. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a cascade of pure light, a river of flawless, impossibly large diamonds, culminating in a single magnificent pear-shaped stone the size of a robin's egg. It blazed with an inner fire, casting prismatic light across her collarbones, so brilliant it seemed to hum with its own energy. Tiffany, oblivious, tugged on his sleeve. "Who is that? My God, look at her necklace. It must be fake. It has to be." But Jameson knew. He had spent his life evaluating value, assessing assets, and he knew with a certainty that turned his stomach to ice that the diamonds around his ex-wife's neck were not fake. And they weren't just expensive, they were legendary. The silence in the hall broke, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched buzz, the sound of 1,000 whispered questions. "Who is she? Is that Amelia Varner? Where did she get that? Look at the necklace. Is that? It can't be." Jameson felt rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process the impossible image before him. It was like seeing a ghost, but a ghost that had returned from the afterlife, draped in the GDP of a small nation. The woman at the entrance was Amelia. Yes, the shape of her face, the quiet confidence in her eyes, that was all her. But this version was amplified, polished to a terrifying brilliance. The Schiaparelli gown, the regal posture, and the necklace. That goddamn necklace. Jameson, what's wrong?" Tiffany's voice was sharp, laced with a nascent panic. She had followed his gaze and the frozen horror on his face. "Do you know her?" He couldn't form words. He just nodded a jerky mechanical motion. Tiffany's eyes widened first in confusion, then in dawning venomous realization. Wait, no, is that your ex-wife, the librarian? He'd told Tiffany that Amelia was a librarian. It was simpler, a cleaner narrative. It made his choice to leave her seem logical, an act of shedding a provincial past. Art historian sounded too sophisticated. Antique appraiser was too vague. Librarian was perfect in its drab simplicity. She's not a librarian, Jameson managed to grit out his voice, a low rasp. The crowd began to part for Amelia, as she moved, not with hesitation, but with the unhurried grace of someone who owned her space. She wasn't walking into a room of strangers. She was re-entering a world she had apparently never truly left. She nodded subtly to a few people, a senator's wife, a tech billionaire, who looked at her with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. Then her eyes met Jameson's. Across the expanse of marble and money, their gazes locked. There was no anger in her expression, no pain, no hint of the woman he had condescendingly dismissed 6 months ago. What he saw was far worse, a cool, dispassionate assessment. It was the same look she used to give a piece of antique porcelain, evaluating its authenticity, its history, its worth. In that moment, he felt like a cheap forgery. Panic gave way to a surge of hot, possessive anger. Who was she trying to fool? This was a stunt, a pathetic attempt to make him jealous. Where did she get the money for this charade, the settlement impossible? The gown alone cost 6 figures. The necklace was unthinkable. She must have rented it, or borrowed it. Or worse, she had a new man, a rich one. The thought sent a jolt of primitive territorial fury through him. He had to confront her. He had to expose this facade. "Excuse me," he said curtly to the group he was with, disentangling his arm from Tiffany's desperate grip. "Jameson, don't," Tiffany hissed, grabbing his elbow. "You'll make a scene. I'm going to find out what game she's playing," he snarled, pulling away from her and striding purposefully toward Amelia. The crowd watched their gossip now, fueled by the promise of live drama. This was better than the auction. This was blood sport. Amelia saw him coming. She didn't flinch. She simply stopped near a marble column, taking a flute of champagne from a passing waiter, and waited for him. As he approached, he got a closer look at the necklace. The central diamond was F-color, internally flawless. He knew that much from his own forays into buying Tiffany baubles. But the sheer size and provenance it hinted at were beyond his comprehension. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a historical artifact. "Amelia," he said, his voice tight and low, "what is this?" She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her grey eyes meeting his over the rim of the glass. "Jameson, I wasn't sure if you'd still be on the guest list." The barb was so subtle, so perfectly delivered, it took him a second to register the insult. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, ignoring her jab. "And what in God's name are you wearing? It's a Schiaparelli full couture," she replied calmly, as if he were asking about the weather. "I was worried it might be a bit understated for the occasion." His face darkened. "I'm not talking about the dress. I'm talking about that." He gestured angrily at the blaze of diamonds on her chest. "Where did you get it? Did you rent it to try and make me jealous? Is that it? Because it's pathetic." A small smile touched Amelia's lips, a genuinely amused expression that infuriated him more than any outburst could have. "Rent it, Jameson, please. One doesn't rent L'Étoile de Minuit." L'Étoile de Minuit, the midnight star. The name echoed in his head, familiar from some long-forgotten article or documentary. A legendary piece, lost for decades, rumored to have once belonged to Russian royalty. A mythical, priceless object. "That's not L'Étoile de Minuit," he scoffed, his voice betraying his dawning horror. "That's impossible. It's been missing since the 1950s. "It wasn't missing," Amelia corrected him gently. "It was in a private collection in Geneva. The owner was a client of mine. He passed away recently, and his estate decided to liquidate some assets. I handled the private sale. Jameson stared at her, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and denial. You handled it. What are you talking about? You appraised junk for old ladies in Connecticut. That's what you chose to believe, isn't it? She said, her voice still impossibly serene. It was a more comfortable narrative for you. Before he could respond, a voice dripping with saccharine venom cut in. Well, 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 look what the cat dragged in. It was Tiffany who had followed him, her face a mask of jealousy. She sauntered up, positioning herself possessively at Jameson's side. She looked Amelia up and down, her eyes lingering on the necklace with a greedy, dismissive glare. That's a very loud piece of costume jewelry. You must have spent your entire divorce settlement on it. I hope you kept the receipt. The insult was so crass, so juvenile, that a few people nearby winced. Amelia didn't even flinch. She simply shifted her gaze from Jameson to Tiffany, her expression one of polite, clinical curiosity. She took in the bright yellow dress, the over-styled hair, the desperate glint in the younger woman's eyes. Then she looked back at Jameson. This is your different kind of partner, Amelia asked, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. The one who understands the game. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture of profound disappointment. It wasn't pity, it was a verdict. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Jameson standing there. Tiffany's presence beside him, suddenly feeling cheap and suffocating, the whispers of the crowd closing in like the walls of a tomb. He wasn't the king anymore. He was the court jester in a tragedy of his own making, and the curtain had just gone up. The shockwave of Amelia's presence, and more specifically, her necklace, rippled through the Met. The elite of New York were not easily impressed, but the sight of a piece like L'Étoile de Minuit was akin to seeing a unicorn trot through the Temple of Dendur. It was a disruption of the natural order. Beatrice Fairfax, the city's most feared and respected society columnist, a woman whose pen could make or break reputations overnight, was holding court near the Rodin sculptures. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, were fixed on Amelia. It is her, Beatrice murmured to her companion, a cackling doyenne of old money named Eleanor van der Sloot. Amelia Varner. I haven't seen her since before the divorce. Jameson kept her locked away like a dirty little secret. Secret. Darling, it looks like the secret was that she was the one holding the key to the vault. Eleanor rasped, raising her lorgnette to get a better look at the necklace. My God, Beatrice, that is the real article. I saw a photograph of it in a book on the Romanov jewels 50 years ago. I thought it was lost forever. The story I heard, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is that Jameson dumped her because she wasn't socially aggressive enough. He picked up that glittery little mannequin. She nodded towards Tiffany, who was now frantically trying to get Jameson's attention to be his arm candy. It seems he traded a Fort Knox gold bar for a piece of tinsel. The whispers followed Amelia as she moved through the room. She was no longer just Jameson Varner's mousy ex-wife. She was a mystery, a power player who had emerged from the shadows. The men who had previously only given Jameson the time of day now watched her with a new calculating interest. The women who had once pitied her now looked at her with a potent cocktail of envy and awe. Jameson felt their gazes shift away from him. His triumph had evaporated. The Forbes article, the Aerosynth deal, it was all forgotten, eclipsed by the woman he had cast aside. He was no longer the sun around which this universe revolved. He was a minor planet, suddenly pulled into the orbit of a new blazing star. His mind was racing, trying to assemble the pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. She handled the private sale. What did that mean? His Amelia? The woman who got anxious speaking to a group of more than 5 people, handling a multi-million-dollar off-market transaction for a legendary diamond. It made no sense. This had to be a lie, a bluff. He saw Marcus Thorne, his rival, deep in conversation with a Swiss banker. They both glanced at Jameson, and Marcus gave him a slow, predatory smile. Thorne wasn't looking at him with envy anymore. He was looking at him like he was a wounded animal, a fool who had fundamentally misjudged the assets under his own roof. In their world, such a lapse in judgment was not just embarrassing, it was a sign of weakness, a fatal flaw. "Jameson, everyone is staring," Tiffany whined, her voice high and strained. "Do something. Tell them she's lying. Tell them it's fake." "Be quiet, Tiffany." He snapped, his patience worn to a thread. Her presence, once a symbol of his virility and success, now felt like an anchor dragging him down. Her bright dress was suddenly garish, her voice grating. He needed answers. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to text his lawyer. "Emergency. Call me. What do you know about Emilia's business activities, post-divorce?" As he hit send, a figure approached Emilia. Jameson's heart sank even further. It was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur Pendleton was not just rich. He was generational wealth, a name synonymous with integrity and immense understated power. He was old money royalty, the chairman of the museum's board, and a man whose quiet nod of approval was worth more than $1 billion line of credit. He was untouchable, a living institution, and he was walking directly towards Emilia, a wide, genuine smile on his face. "Emilia, my dear," Arthur's warm, baritone voice echoed in the suddenly quiet space around them. "You look absolutely radiant. L'Etoile suits you far better than it ever did sitting in that dusty vault in Geneva." Emilia smiled, a genuine, warm smile that Jameson hadn't seen in years. "Arthur, thank you for convincing me to wear it. I felt it deserved a night out." "Deserved? My dear, you've resurrected a legend," he said, taking her hand and kissing it gently. "And the Schiaparelli is a perfect choice. Daniel Rosebery would be proud." Jameson watched, dumbfounded. Arthur Pendleton knew her. Not just knew her, but admired her. He was talking to her as an equal, a peer. He even knew the name of the designer. The world had tilted on its axis. Arthur then turned his gaze, cool and appraising, towards the rest of the room. His eyes swept past Jameson, as if he were a piece of furniture, and he addressed the crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying an effortless authority. "For those of you who are wondering," Arthur announced, his hand gesturing towards the necklace, "I can personally attest to the authenticity of this piece. This is indeed L'Étoile de Minuit, the centerpiece of the Orlov collection, thought to have been lost after its sale in 1953. It was recently handled in a private acquisition by one of the world's most discreet and brilliant appraisers of high jewelry and fine art." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he placed a paternal hand on Emilia's shoulder. "That appraiser, whose clients include the Getty, the Louvre, and some of the most discerning private collectors on the planet, is my dear friend and our museum's most trusted acquisitions consultant, Ms. Emilia Varner." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Ms. Emilia Varner, not Mrs. She had dropped his name. She had her own identity, an identity so powerful and respected that Arthur Pendleton himself was acting as her herald. Jameson felt the blood drain from his face. His phone buzzed in his hand. It was his lawyer. He didn't need to read the message. He already knew. The cute hobby he had so casually mocked, the little business he'd never bothered to ask about, was not a side hustle. It was a global empire of taste and value operating in a sphere so elite he didn't even know it existed. And the woman he had divorced for being ordinary was in reality one of the most powerful people in the room. He just hadn't been smart enough to see it. The revelation hung in the air, thick and shimmering as the heat from the diamond necklace itself. Arthur Pendleton's endorsement was an irrefutable stamp of authenticity, not just for the jewel, but for Emilia herself. Jameson felt a profound, dizzying sense of vertigo as if the marble floor beneath him had turned to quicksand. He fumbled with his phone, his thumb swiping clumsily to open the message from his lawyer, David. Jameson, I told you her financials were sealed under a very tight custom NDA during the divorce. She insisted on it. Her counsel was from a top-tier Swiss firm, not some local hack. She declared her business EV Consulting, but listed its value as variable. You didn't contest it. You were in a hurry to finalize and focused on protecting Varna Capital's assets. You never asked for a detailed forensic audit of her firm. To be blunt, you didn't think it was worth anything. I advised you it was unusual, but you told me to just get it done. What's going on? Jameson read the message twice, the words blurring in front of his eyes. You didn't think it was worth anything. The sentence echoed in his mind, a chorus of his own arrogance. He remembered that moment vividly. Sitting in David's plush office, he'd laughed. Her little art thing, let her have it. It keeps her happy. Just make sure she can't touch the firm. He had been so focused on protecting himself from her, he never once considered that she was the one with the hidden treasure. The generous settlement he'd given her wasn't a lifeline. It was pocket change, a nuisance tax she'd paid to be rid of him. Across the room, Amelia was now in conversation with a small, captivated group. Arthur Pendleton remained by her side, beaming like a proud mentor. Jameson could see Marcus Thorne sidling up to the group, his expression no longer mocking, but one of deep, calculating interest. He wasn't looking at a fool's ex-wife. He was looking at a potential new partner, a woman with connections that money alone couldn't buy. Driven by a morbid, self-destructive need to understand the full scope of his folly, Jameson began to move towards them. He was a moth drawn to the flame that had incinerated his world. Tiffany trailed behind him, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, confused silence. As he drew closer, he could hear Amelia's voice. It was the same calm, measured tone she'd always used, but now instead of discussing which variety of tomato to plant in the garden, she was dissecting the history of a dynasty. The difficulty wasn't in authenticating the stone itself, Amelia was saying to the Swiss banker Jameson had seen earlier. The GIA certification was impeccable. The real work was in the provenance. The seller had purchase receipts from Christie's 1953 auction, but the paper trail between St. Petersburg in 1917 and London in 1953 was fragmented. It involved tracing letters, diary entries, and shipping manifests thought to be lost in the war. Incredible, the banker breathed, his eyes wide with admiration. How did you bridge the gap? Amelia's lips curved in a small smile. The previous owner thought the key was in the Russian archives, but he was looking in the wrong place. The jewel wasn't smuggled out by the Romanovs, but by a lady-in-waiting who sold it to a French diplomat in Istanbul in 1920. I found a reference to a star falling at midnight in the diplomat's wife's diary, which is housed in a private collection in Florence. My research in the De Medici archives last spring gave me access. Jameson stopped dead. The De Medici archives. Last spring. She had told him she was going to Florence for a research trip. He'd pictured her puttering around museums, a lonely tourist. He'd even made a joke about it. Don't spend all your alimony in one place. He'd texted her a cruel parting shot after the papers were signed. He had imagined her on a budget tour. In reality, she was unlocking a 100-year-old secret that would culminate in a multi-million-dollar transaction. Every boring trip, every late night spent poring over dusty old books, every conversation he'd tuned out because it wasn't about money or markets. It was all part of this. She hadn't been building a hobby. She had been building an empire, brick by painstaking brick, right under his nose, and he had been too blind, too self-absorbed to see it. Arthur Pendleton caught Jameson's eye from across the small circle. There was no triumph in the old man's gaze, only a cool, profound disappointment. Of course, Arthur said, his voice carrying just enough for Jameson to hear clearly. True value is often overlooked by those dazzled by the superficial. It takes a discerning eye to spot a masterpiece, whether it's a diamond or a person. The words struck Jameson with the force of a physical blow. It was a direct indictment, delivered with surgical precision in front of his greatest rival. Marcus Thorne turned his head slightly, a shark-like smile gracing his lips. "Well," said Arthur, "judgment is everything in our business, isn't it, Varner?" he said, addressing Jameson directly for the first time that night. The use of his surname was a deliberate slight, a reclassification from peer to subordinate. "You have to know what your assets are really worth." Jameson had no response. His throat was tight, his mind a blank slate of humiliation. Amelia finally turned her gaze to him. The polite mask was gone. For a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of the woman he once knew, not of pain, but of a deep, sorrowful clarity. It was the look of someone who had once loved him and was now seeing with finality the full pathetic measure of the man he had become. "The necklace isn't mine, by the way," she said, her voice quiet but clear, speaking directly to him and the captivated onlookers. "I'm merely its custodian for the evening." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. "I secured it tonight for the auction's grand prize. The client who purchased it through me wished to donate it anonymously to St. Jude. The proceeds from its auction tonight will fund the hospital's new research wing." She had not worn the necklace to show off her wealth. She had worn it as an act of staggering, world-changing philanthropy. She had brought a legend back to life, not for her own aggrandizement, but to save the lives of children. In that moment, Jameson Varner understood. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had discarded a masterpiece. And in front of the entire world, she had just unveiled herself. The aftermath of Amelia's revelation was not a loud explosion, but a quiet seismic shift that reordered the entire social and financial landscape of the room. The auction for L'Étoile de Minuit, announced by a visibly emotional Arthur Pendleton, became the stuff of legend. Bidding started at a staggering $10 million, was fierce with phone-in bids from Dubai, Hong Kong, and London. It ultimately sold for an astronomical $27.4 million, every cent going to St. Jude. Amelia's name was on everyone's lips, now synonymous not with glamour or revenge, but with staggering competence and breathtaking generosity. For Jameson, the rest of the evening was a waking nightmare. He was a ghost at the feast. People who had been clamoring for his attention hours earlier now looked through him. Their conversations would dip to a hush when he approached, only to resume with renewed animation once he had passed. He was no longer a king or a predator. He was a cautionary tale. The man who had a winning lottery ticket and used it to light a cheap cigar. The most cutting moments were the subtle ones. A potential investor who had been chasing him for weeks now clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Tough night, Varner. Reminds you to always do your due diligence, eh?" Before walking away to join Marcus Thorne's circle. The message was clear. If you couldn't properly evaluate the asset, sleeping in your own bed, how could you be trusted to evaluate a multi-billion-dollar corporation? Marcus Thorne, for his part, was holding court, basking in Jameson's public humiliation. Jameson saw him laughing with the Swiss banker and two other hedge fund managers, all of them glancing his way. He didn't need to hear their words to know the narrative being spun. Jameson Varner, the one-trick pony, blinded by ego, who fumbled the most valuable asset he ever had. His reputation, as carefully constructed and polished as his Tom Ford suit, was unraveling thread by thread. Then there was Tiffany. The shock had worn off, replaced by a sullen, simmering rage. She wasn't angry on his behalf. She was angry for herself. Her ticket to the A-list had just been publicly invalidated. "I can't believe this," she hissed, as they stood awkwardly near the exit, waiting for a car that couldn't come soon enough. "You made me look like an idiot, a librarian. You told me she was a librarian." "It's complicated, Tiffany," Jameson said, his voice hollow. "No, it's not," she shot back, her voice attracting stares. "She's everything, and you're the guy who let her go. Everyone here is laughing at you, which means they're laughing at me." Her self-absorption was so total, so complete, that it was almost a parody. He looked at her, then really looked at her. At the desperate grasping for status, the transactional nature of her affection, the utter lack of depth. She was the reflection he had wanted, and now he saw that the reflection was shallow, distorted, and cheap. He had chosen this. He had traded Amelia's quiet brilliance for this loud, empty vessel. The ride back to his sterile glass-walled penthouse in Soho was silent and fraught with tension. The city lights, which usually made him feel powerful, now seemed to mock him, illuminating a failure so profound it felt existential. When they entered the apartment, Tiffany finally exploded. "So what now? Is she going to take all your money? That settlement, was that a joke? Are you going to be poor?" The question was so crass, so revealing of her true motivations, that something inside Jameson finally snapped. The humiliation, the anger, the self-loathing, it all coalesced into a single icy point of clarity. "The settlement is irrelevant, Tiffany," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And my money is none of your concern. You should pack your things." She stared at him, her jaw dropping. "What, you're dumping me? After she embarrassed you?" "No," Jameson said, walking over to the vast window and staring out at the city that no longer felt like his. "I'm just finally appraising my assets correctly. And this," he gestured vaguely between them, "is a liability I can no longer afford." He didn't watch her pack. He didn't listen to her screamed insults or the slam of the door. He just stood there, watching the endless river of headlights below, feeling an emptiness he hadn't known since he was a broke kid with nothing to his name. The real collapse came over the next 2 weeks. The Aerosynth acquisition, his crowning achievement, suddenly hit a snag. A key group of shareholders, influenced by a board member who had been at the gala, called for a last-minute review of his leadership and judgment. The Forbes article was now a source of mockery on financial blogs. An old mentor called him. "Jameson," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "I heard what happened. Son, you committed the cardinal sin. You let your ego write a check your intelligence couldn't cash. The deal didn't fall through completely, but the terms were forcibly renegotiated. He lost a significant percentage of his controlling stake. It was a financial wound that would bleed for years. Marcus Thorne, smelling blood in the water, launched a hostile campaign to poach his top analysts. 3 of them left within a week. His house of cards, built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and perceived power, was collapsing. And it was all because he had failed to read the fine print on the one person who had been his bedrock. He hadn't just lost a woman, he had lost his credibility, the very currency he valued above all else. And in the silent, empty penthouse that was supposed to be his castle, Jameson Varner was finally truly alone with the wreckage. 3 months later, the city had shed its summer languor for the crisp golden light of autumn. The air carrying the first hints of winter felt charged with purpose, a feeling that mirrored Amelia Varner's new reality. Her world was now headquartered on the 15th floor of the new Solstice Tower, a marvel of sustainable architecture that pierced the midtown skyline. The office itself was a testament to her ethos. It wasn't the cold, ostentatious gallery of chrome and glass that Jameson would have demanded. Instead, it was a sanctuary of reclaimed oak floors, soft, natural light, and walls painted a calming gallery white. The art was minimal but profound. A small, breathtaking drawing by Keta Kollwitz, a vibrant abstract by a promising young artist she was mentoring. Nothing was for show. Everything was for love. From her desk, a single slab of polished concrete, she had an unobstructed panoramic view of Central Park, its canopy a breathtaking tapestry of amber ochre and deep crimson. This view was the inverse of Jameson's. He had always faced the steel and glass canyons of the financial district, a view of conquest. Hers was a view of life, of cycles, of natural enduring beauty. Spread before her were the architectural blueprints for the Emilia Varna Wing for Pediatric Oncological Research. The paper was covered in her notes, written in a precise, elegant script. She wasn't just a name on a building, she was an active participant. Her finger traced the layout of a family consultation room, and she made a note in the margin. Softer lighting, non-clinical furniture, needs to feel like a living room, not a waiting room. She knew that healing was about more than medicine. It was about dignity and comfort details a man like Jameson would have deemed an inefficient expense. The staggering 27.4 million raised from the auction of L'Etoile de Minuit had been the catalyst, but her true work began the day after the gala. She had founded the Midnight Star Foundation, and with the same meticulous dedication she once applied to tracing the provenance of a lost jewel, she began building a new legacy. She spent weeks personally courting philanthropists, not with slick presentations, but with quiet, compelling conversations about tangible outcomes. She didn't sell them a dream. She presented them with a meticulously researched plan. They weren't just donating to a cause. They were investing in her vision and her unimpeachable competence. A soft knock came at the door, which was always open. Her assistant Chloe, a bright-eyed Columbia art history graduate whom Amelia had taken under her wing, stood in the doorway. "Miss Varner, Mr. Pendleton is on the line for you. He says it's the call you've been waiting for." Amelia's calm expression broke into a genuine, radiant smile. "Thank you, Chloe. Put him through." Arthur's voice, warm and familiar, filled the serene office. "Amelia, my dear, I've just left the hospital board meeting. The final round of funding from the European Consortium has been approved. They said your proposal was the most thorough and compelling they'd seen in a decade. They're calling you a saint around here." Amelia leaned back in her chair, a light, easy laugh bubbling up. It was a sound Jameson had rarely heard. "I'm hardly a saint, Arthur. I'm just a librarian who knows how to read a balance sheet." It was their cherished private joke, a reclamation of the word Jameson had used as a weapon. He had meant it to signify irrelevana and mediocrity. To Amelia and Arthur, it now signified a superpower, the ability to find extraordinary value where others saw only dust. "Well, this librarian is about to change the face of pediatric cancer treatment," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond mere pride. "I am endlessly honored to be a witness to it." After they said their goodbyes, Amelia swiveled her chair to face the window. She watched a lone hawk circle over the park, its movements effortless and precise. Her victory that night at the gala had never been about revenge. Revenge was a hot, fleeting emotion, and what she felt now was a deep, resonant peace. The humiliation of Jameson had simply been a consequence, the unavoidable splash as she finally broke the surface. Her true triumph was this: the quiet, constructive power she now wielded. The blueprints on her desk, the future she was building not on the ashes of her past, but on the solid foundation of her own reclaimed identity. Miles away in a cramped office on a lower floor of a less prestigious building, Jameson Varner stared at a brick wall. This was his new view. After selling the Soho penthouse and his collection of modern art to cover the catastrophic losses from the Aerosynth renegotiation, this was what he could afford. Varner Capital was a ghost ship. The phones, which once rang incessantly with offers and inside tips, were mostly silent. His top analysts had long since jumped ship, recruited by a triumphant Marcus Thorne. His laptop screen displayed an article from a financial blog titled "The Midas Touch in Reverse: How Jameson Varner Fumbled an Empire." It featured an unflattering photo of him from the gala, his face a mask of slack-jawed shock. He was now a business school case study on the dangers of hubris. The man who had been the subject of a Forbes cover story was now a punchline. He thought of Tiffany, whose name he now saw, linked to some tech billionaire who was 10 years younger than him. He'd seen a photo of her on a yacht in Monaco wearing a diamond necklace that was large, flashy, and utterly devoid of history or grace. It was the perfect metaphor for her. He felt a pang not of lost love, but of a profound, nauseating self-disgust for his own cheap taste. The deepest wound, however, was Amelia. Her name was now spoken with the kind of reverence once reserved for Carnegies and Rockefellers. She was a force, an architect of change. The ghost of their life together haunted him, but now the memories were cast in a new excruciating light. He remembered an evening years ago, her birthday. He had been late, stuck on a conference call for a deal that had eventually collapsed. He came home to find she had cooked his favorite meal. On the table was a small velvet-wrapped box. Inside was a pair of antique cufflinks. They belonged to a Danish shipping magnate from the 1890s, she'd said, her eyes shining with excitement. His company went public and revolutionized trade in the North Sea. I thought you should have them. A piece of history for the man who is making it. He had barely looked at them. Thanks, honey. He'd mumbled, his mind still on the deal. They're nice. He'd tossed them in a drawer and never worn them. Now he understood. It hadn't been just a gift. It was a story, a connection, an act of seeing him so completely that she found a piece of the past that mirrored her hopes for his future. And he had been blind to it, utterly damnably blind. A month ago, in a fit of desperation and whiskey, he had composed an email to her. He'd spent hours writing it, deleting paragraphs of self-pitying excuses and accusations, trying to distill his agony into something that sounded like a real apology. Amelia, I know there are no words. I was a fool. I didn't see you. I didn't see anything. I built my life on the wrong metrics. If I could... He had never finished the sentence. He didn't know what he wanted. Forgiveness, absolution. He had sent the rambling, pathetic message and had waited. The reply never came. Her silence was not passive. It was a definitive statement. It was a locked door, a final appraisal. He was no longer a factor in her life, not even one worthy of a formal dismissal. He was simply irrelevant. Chords. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the Manhattan skyline, casting long shadows across the avenue, Amelia left her office building. The doorman, who greeted her with a respectful, "Good evening, Miss Varner," held the door as she stepped into the crisp air. She was on her way to a quiet dinner with Arthur and his wife, a simple pleasure she now had time to enjoy. As she waited for her car, a young woman with a determined look in her eye approached her, holding a press badge from the Wall Street Journal. "Miss Varner, forgive me for bothering you. I'm doing a profile on your foundation's incredible impact. Everyone is talking about your meteoric rise. You seem to come out of nowhere to become one of the most influential figures in both the art world and philanthropy. If you don't mind me asking, what's your secret?" Amelia turned to face the young reporter. She didn't feel flustered or annoyed by the intrusion. She looked at the earnest face before her, and for a fleeting moment saw her entire journey reflected in the question. She saw the quiet libraries, the dusty archives in Florence, the long nights spent cross-referencing auction catalogues, while Jameson slept oblivious. She saw the condescending pats on the head, the patient smile she wore as her work was dismissed as a hobby. She saw the walk into the gala, the weight of l'étoile de minuit on her skin, less a burden and more a suit of armor she had forged herself. She gave the reporter a small, knowing smile, the kind that holds entire worlds of experience. "There's no secret," Amelia said, her voice clear and steady above the city's hum. "I didn't come out of nowhere. I was always there. The work was always being done. The value was always present." She held the reporter's gaze, letting the truth of her words sink in. It just took a while for the world to learn how to see it. With a polite nod, she turned as her car pulled up to the curb. As she slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, solid thud, she looked forward through the windshield at the city lights beginning to sparkle ahead. She was not looking back. She was no longer just appraising masterpieces. She had finally and irrevocably become one. And there you have it. A story not just about the satisfying fall of an arrogant man, but about the glorious rise of a woman who was told she was ordinary. Emilia's power wasn't in the $5,000 necklace. That was just a symptom. Her true power was in the quiet, consistent work she did in the shadows, in the value she built when no one was watching. It reminds us that true worth isn't about the noise you make, but the foundation you build. Have you ever felt underestimated? Have you ever had to hide your own light for someone else? Let us know your story in the comments below. We read every single one. The air in the grand ballroom wasn't just thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. It was crackling with the electric tension of a story about to reach its climax, though no one knew it yet. For one man, Nathaniel Sterling, this was the pinnacle of his success, a night to be crowned king. For one woman, his ex-wife Catherine Vance, it was supposed to be a quiet night of professional obligation. But in a world of blinding spotlights and whispered gossip, a single microphone can become a weapon. And tonight, a weapon fired in arrogance would trigger an explosion of consequence that would bring an entire industry to its knees. The Apex Innovators Gala was the Oscars of the tech world, a self-congratulatory spectacle held in the cavernous ballroom of the St. Regis, New York. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto a sea of black ties and designer gowns. The clinking of champagne flutes was the evening's percussion, a constant rhythm beneath the murmur of billion-dollar deals and carefully curated pleasantries. Nathaniel Sterling swam through these waters like a shark. He was the CEO of Momentum Dynamics, a company that had, under his leadership, become the darling of the Ethelred global conglomerate. He was handsome in a severe corporate way, sharp jaw, meticulously styled, dark hair, and eyes that held the cold glint of perpetual calculation. On his arm was Brielle, a model, 2 decades his junior, a stunning accessory, whose laughter was as bright and empty as the flashbulbs that followed them. Tonight, Nathaniel was slated to receive the Innovator of the Year award. It was in his mind an inevitability, a confirmation of his genius. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, shaking hands, clapping backs, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He was a king in his court, and he savoured every moment of the adulation. Then he saw her. Catherine Vance stood near a marble pillar observing the spectacle with a quiet detachment. She wasn't dressed to compete. While other women wore vibrant silks and audacious sequins, Catherine wore a simple, impeccably tailored, navy blue gown that spoke of elegance, not extravagance. Her auburn hair was styled in a low, graceful chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of understated pearl earrings. She held a glass of sparkling water, a small island of calm in the churning ocean of egos. A flash of irritation crossed Nathaniel's face, a barely perceptible tightening around his mouth. He hadn't expected her to be here. Their divorce, finalized 2 years ago, had been acrimonious. He had painted her as the unsupportive, unambitious wife who couldn't keep up with his meteoric rise. In reality, she had been the co-architect of his early success, the strategist behind the curtain, whose contributions he had systematically erased from the corporate narrative. "Well, well," he said, steering Brielle toward her. His voice was a smooth, condescending purr. "Catherine, I must say I'm surprised to see you here. I didn't think this was your kind of scene." Brielle looked Catherine up and down, a flicker of dismissive curiosity in her eyes. "Nate, honey, who is this?" "This is Catherine," Nathaniel said, the emphasis on the past tense hanging in the air. "My ex-wife." He gestured vaguely at her. "She runs what is it you call it? CAT, a little consulting firm now. Keeping busy, are we?" The insult was designed to sting, to frame her life's work as a trivial hobby. He knew exactly what Vance Strategic Solutions was. He just preferred his version of the story. Catherine's gaze was steady. She offered a polite, closed-lip smile that didn't betray a hint of the fury that once would have consumed her. She had spent 2 years forging her emotions into steel. Nathaniel, Brielle, it's a pleasure. Her voice was low and even, a stark contrast to his performative boom. My firm advises on corporate restructuring and efficiency. It does keep me quite busy, thank you. Restructuring, Nathaniel chuckled, sharing a look with a passing sycophant. Sounds adorable. Well, don't let us keep you from your networking. He gave her a final, pitying look, as if she were a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. He then turned his back on her, a deliberate and public dismissal, and guided Brielle toward their table at the foot of the stage. The message was clear: you are in my world now, and you are nothing. Catherine watched him go, her knuckles white around her glass. The old wounds throbbed with a familiar ache. She remembered the nights spent mapping out business plans on their kitchen table plans, he later presented as his own. She remembered him calling her meticulous research overly cautious, and her brilliant insights cute ideas. He hadn't just left her, he had tried to dismantle her sense of self-worth, brick by painful brick. A waiter passed, and she placed her untouched glass on his tray. She took a deep, steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and let her gaze sweep across the room. Nathaniel saw her as a ghost from his past, a footnote in his grand story. He had no idea she was the author of the next chapter. He thought she was here as a spectator. He was wrong. She was here for the kill. She wasn't just a guest. She was an invited VIP of the night's true power, the man who owned the entire chessboard, Alistair Finch, the formidable chairman of Ethelred Global. Her work wasn't just keeping her busy. It was about to change everything. The gala was just beginning, but for Nathaniel Sterling, the end was already in sight. The gala unfolded with choreographed precision. Salads were served, wine was poured, and a series of minor awards were distributed to polite, if unenthusiastic, applause. Nathaniel was a coiled spring of anticipation at his table. He held court, regaling his companions with anecdotes of his corporate conquests, while Brielle laughed on cue, her hand possessively on his arm. Every so often, his eyes would flick towards Catherine's table, a small, superior smile playing on his lips when he saw her sitting alone, speaking to no one. He interpreted her solitude as isolation, her poise as a brave face against irrelevance. Finally, the moment arrived. The host, a comedian whose jokes were as expensive as they were unfunny, boomed into the microphone. And now the award you've all been waiting for, the 2020 Apex Innovator of the Year, an award for vision, for disruption, for sheer unadulterated success. The winner is Mr. Nathaniel Sterling of Momentum Dynamics. The room erupted. Spotlights converged on Nathaniel's table as he rose, basking in the manufactured adoration. He kissed Brielle theatrically, a gesture for the cameras, and strode towards the stage with the confidence of a man who believes the world owes him its applause. He accepted the heavy stylized crystal trophy, holding it aloft like a conquered relic. Thank you. He began, his voice resonating with false humility. Thank you to the committee, to my incredible team at Momentum Dynamics, and of course, to the board of Ethelred Global for believing in our vision. He delivered the standard sanitized platitudes for the first minute. He thanked his engineers, his marketing department, his executive assistant. The crowd listened politely, but then a shift occurred. A sly, cruel light entered his eyes. He was about to go off script. You know, he said, leaning closer to the microphone, his tone becoming conspiratorial. True innovation requires sacrifice. It requires a relentless, almost monastic dedication. You have to be willing to shed everything that holds you back. You have to cut away the dead weight. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The tone had become personal. Some people, he continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing for a fraction of a second on Catherine, are content with the small life. They have small dreams. They start little projects, little hobbies to pass the time. And that's fine. It's Nice. The word nice was delivered with such dripping condescension, it felt like an obscenity. But you cannot change the world from the safety of the shallow end. You cannot build an empire if you are afraid to get your hands dirty, if you are more concerned with balance than with victory. He didn't need to say her name. Everyone who mattered in their shared social and professional circle knew exactly who he was talking about. It was a public vivisection, a deliberate and calculated humiliation, disguised as a motivational speech. He was branding her a failure on the biggest stage of his life, solidifying his narrative that he had triumphed by leaving her behind. The camera panned across the audience, and for a moment it rested on Catherine. She sat perfectly still, her expression a mask of serene neutrality. Inside, however, a storm raged. Each word was a sharpened stone hurled at the fragile edifice of composure she had so carefully constructed. He wasn't just mocking her business, he was mocking her very essence, her belief that success could be achieved with integrity and intellect rather than brute force and narcissism. She could feel the pitying stares of those around her, the whispered comments, the morbid curiosity. A slow, hot anger began to burn away the pain. An anger so cold and pure, it felt like ice in her veins. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he couldn't see the tidal wave about to crash down on him. He thought this was his coronation. He had no idea it was his public execution. Nathaniel finished his speech with a final triumphant flourish. So to all the dreamers, I say this dream bigger. Bet on yourself, and never ever settle. The applause was thunderous, fueled by the raw drama he had injected into the evening. He walked off the stage, a conquering hero, and returned to his table, where Brielle embraced him with feverish pride. He glanced at Catherine one last time, a smirk of finality on his face. Checkmate, his eyes said. Catherine met his gaze across the room. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes held a new light, not of defeat, but of something far more dangerous. It was the quiet, patient look of a predator that has just watched its prey walk directly into a perfectly set trap. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, the gesture imbued with a chilling finality. The sting of his words was real, but the satisfaction of what was to come would be her balm. As the applause for Nathaniel died down, and the waiters began clearing the main course plates, Catherine remained a statue of composure. But behind her calm facade, her mind was a whirlwind, replaying not the humiliation of the last 5 minutes, but the calculated strategy of the last 18 months. The unraveling of their marriage had been a slow, insidious process. Nathaniel hadn't just cheated or left. He had gaslighted her into believing her own ambition was a flaw. She'd been the one with the MBA from Wharton, the one who saw the market gap for integrated, intuitive user interface software when he was still coding basic apps in their spare bedroom. Momentum Dynamics was born from her market analysis, her financial modeling, her strategic vision. He was the charismatic salesman, the face of the operation. She was the architect, the mind. In the beginning, they were a team, but as success grew, so did his ego. We don't need to be that meticulous cat, he'd say, dismissing her detailed risk assessments. You're overthinking it. Her contributions were slowly reframed as nagging her caution as fear. The final blow came when he secured the acquisition deal with Ethelred Global. In the final presentation to their board, he presented her entire 5-year strategic plan as his own singular vision. When she confronted him, he told her she was being emotional and needed to see the bigger picture, his picture. The divorce was his final act of erasure. He used his newfound wealth and power to secure a team of ruthless lawyers who painted her as a bitter woman seeking an undeserved slice of his empire. Exhausted and heartbroken, she'd accepted a settlement that was generous by normal standards, but insulting given her foundational role in the company. She walked away with enough capital to start over, and something far more valuable, a burning diamond-hard resolve. She founded Vance Strategic Solutions, from a small, leased office with a second-hand desk and a state-of-the-art computer. Her shingle was out, but she wasn't chasing just any client. She was targeting a very specific niche legacy: conglomerates struggling with innovation lag and inefficient subsidiary management. She built her reputation quietly, project by project, delivering brutal but brilliant analyses that cut through corporate politics and delivered actionable, profit-driving results. Her name became a closely guarded secret in certain C-suites, a weapon to be deployed when a company needed to fix a deep structural problem. Her endgame, however, had always been Ethelred Global. She knew from the inside out that the conglomerate, while powerful, was a lumbering giant. Its tech division, propped up by the star performance of Momentum Dynamics, was riddled with redundancies and stagnant leadership in its other less glamorous subsidiaries. 16 months ago, she had leveraged a contact from her Wharton alumni network to secure a low-level meeting with a mid-tier manager in Ethelred's strategic oversight department. She presented a 10-page preliminary analysis, unsolicited, of the cross-subsidiary inefficiencies within their tech portfolio. It was so sharp, so insightful, that it was quietly escalated up the chain of command. 2 months later, she found herself in the top-floor office of the Ethelred Tower, sitting across a vast mahogany desk from Alistair Finch himself. Finch was a legend, a 70-year-old titan of industry with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being able to smell corporate rot from a mile away. He had her unsolicited report in his hands. "This is aggressive, Ms. Vance," he'd said, his voice a low gravel. "You've identified problems my own internal auditors have been too polite or too fearful to articulate. Politeness doesn't increase shareholder value, Mr. Finch," she had replied, her voice steady. That was the beginning. For the next year, Catherine and her small elite team worked under a strict non-disclosure agreement, becoming the ghost in Ethelred's machine. She was Finch's secret weapon. They analyzed everything: supply chains, R&D pipelines, personnel redundancies, and most importantly, leadership effectiveness. Her final report, delivered 2 months ago, was a masterpiece of corporate surgery. It detailed how the entire Ethelred Tech division could be streamlined, restructured, and reinvigorated, and it had a final explosive recommendation. The current head of the division was too old guard to implement the necessary changes. A new CEO for the entire division was required, one with vision, a deep understanding of the portfolio's strengths and weaknesses, and the grit to execute a difficult turnaround. And then she analyzed the division's star player, Nathaniel Sterling. Her report on Momentum Dynamics was scathingly objective. It praised the company's market position, but exposed its reliance on a single product line, its dangerously high burn rate, and a corporate culture that rewarded sycophants over innovators. She pointed out that its CEO, while a brilliant marketer, lacked the operational discipline for long-term sustainable growth. He was, her report concluded, a charismatic sprinter, not a strategic marathon runner. He was a risk to Ethelred's long-term stability. Alistair Finch had read the report, his face unreadable. "You've handed me a loaded gun, Ms. Vance," he'd said, "and you've pointed it at the man who is currently our media darling." "I was hired to find the truth, Mr. Finch, not to write fan fiction," she replied. A slow smile had spread across the old man's face. "Indeed. I have one final question. In your opinion, who would be the ideal candidate to lead this new division?" Catherine had leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "The ideal candidate would be someone who wrote the playbook for its turnaround. Someone who knows where everybody is buried because they drew the map to the cemetery. Someone who understands both the grand strategy and the granular details. Someone who is being consistently, fatally underestimated." She didn't have to say her own name. He already knew. Her presence here tonight at this specific table, seated alone, was no accident. It was a piece of theatre co-directed by her and Alistair Finch, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act. As the dessert plates were being set, a different kind of hush fell over the room. The boisterous energy from Nathaniel's speech dissipated, replaced by a more sober, respectful silence. The host returned to the stage, his tone now stripped of its earlier levity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce a true titan of industry, a man whose vision has shaped the global economic landscape for over 4 decades. Please welcome the chairman of Ethelred Global, Mr. Alistair Finch. Alistair Finch moved toward the podium, not with the energetic stride of Nathaniel, but with the deliberate, inexorable gravity of a force of nature. He was tall and lean, his silver hair immaculate, his tailored suit a study in understated power. He didn't smile or wave. He simply occupied the stage and by his mere presence commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. Even Nathaniel, still flushed with his own victory, sat up straighter. Finch adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing slightly in the silent hall. He surveyed the audience, his piercing blue eyes seeming to make individual contact with everyone at once. "Good evening," he began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that needed no amplification. "We are here tonight to celebrate innovation. We've handed out trophies, we've applauded success, and that is important. But I am not here tonight to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Ethelred Global did not become what it is by resting on its laurels. We did not thrive by celebrating yesterday's victories. We survived and we lead because we are relentlessly focused on tomorrow, and tomorrow requires a new kind of leadership. Nathaniel listened with a self-satisfied air. He heard Finch's words as an affirmation of his own ethos, the one he had just espoused in his speech. He believed Finch was setting the stage to further praise him, to perhaps even hint at a larger role for him within the conglomerate. "For the past several months," Finch continued, "we have been engaged in a top-to-bottom strategic review of our most critical division, Ethelred Tech. We looked past the headlines. We ignored the hype. We dug into the fundamentals. We analyzed the data, the culture, the leadership, and the long-term strategic viability of every single component." At the mention of a strategic review, a nervous murmur rippled through the executives in the room. This was news to almost everyone. "Our review concluded that while we have pockets of excellence, we also have significant structural weaknesses. We have redundancies. We have stagnation. We have style over substance in places where we desperately need substance." His eyes, for a fleeting moment, seemed to sweep over Nathaniel's table. Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't going the way he expected. "To that end," Finch announced, his voice hardening with authority, "we are enacting a radical restructuring. Effective immediately, all of Ethelred's technology subsidiaries, including Momentum Dynamics, will be consolidated under a single newly formed operational entity, Ethelred Tech Division. This division will have a new mandate, a new structure, and new leadership." The room was now utterly silent. The air crackled. This was no longer an awards gala. It was a public execution of the old guard. Everyone understood the implication. A new divisional CEO meant a new supreme commander, a new kingmaker. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. The consolidation meant his fiefdom. Momentum Dynamics was no longer his private kingdom. He would report to someone else. His mind raced, calculating the odds. Who could it be? Someone from a rival company, an internal promotion from one of the other drabber subsidiaries he'd always disdained. The leader of this new division, Finch said, his voice dropping slightly, building the tension. Cannot be someone who is part of the old way of thinking. They cannot be someone who values applause more than results. They must be a proven strategist, a ruthless pragmatist, and a visionary who can see not just the next quarter, but the next decade. He let the silence hang for a beat, his gaze sweeping the room one last time before it settled with deliberate, unmistakable clarity on Catherine Vance. We did not have to look far. The architect of this new strategy, the author of the very roadmap we intend to follow, is already in this room. She has been working with us in confidence for over a year. She has proven her brilliance, her integrity, and her courage. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He followed Finch's gaze and his eyes locked with Catherine's. In that instant, the entire world tilted on its axis. The condescending smirk, the pitying looks, the public humiliation he had inflicted upon her. It all flashed before his eyes, recast in the horrifying glow of his own epic miscalculation. It wasn't possible. It was a nightmare. Finch's voice boomed, sealing his fate. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to announce the new Chief Executive Officer of the Ethelred Tech Division, Ms. Catherine Vance. The name hung in the air, echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. For a full 3 seconds, nothing happened. No one breathed. No one moved. The collective shock was a physical presence, a thick, invisible blanket that smothered all sound. Then a single spotlight, as if guided by the hand of God, swung away from the stage and bathed Catherine's table in a brilliant, unforgiving white light. Nathaniel Sterling's face was a grotesque mask of disbelief. The colour had drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed horror. His eyes were wide, darting from Catherine to Alistair Finch, and back again, his mind refusing to process the reality of the words he had just heard. The heavy crystal trophy for Innovator of the Year sat on his table, suddenly looking like a cheap, gaudy paperweight. Brielle stared at him, then at Catherine, her perfect brow furrowed in utter confusion. The power dynamic, she understood, had just been violently inverted, and she was lost. From across the room, Catherine rose. She did not stumble or show any sign of surprise. She rose with a fluid, deliberate grace, a woman stepping into a role she had been preparing for her entire life. Her simple navy gown, which had seemed merely elegant before, now looked like a uniform of quiet, unassailable authority. As she began to walk towards the stage, the silence was broken by a smattering of tentative applause led by Alistair Finch himself. The applause quickly swelled, growing from a hesitant trickle into a roaring wave as the reality of the situation dawned on the audience. This wasn't just an announcement. It was a coup. It was a story. And they were witnessing its jaw-dropping conclusion. Catherine's walk was the longest of her life, each step of vindication. She passed tables of stunned executives who had offered her polite, pitying smiles just an hour before. She saw the faces of people who had whispered behind her back after her divorce, siding with the obvious winner. Now they stared at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and frantic recalculation. Her path took her directly past Nathaniel's table. She did not look at him. She did not grant him the satisfaction or the torment of a single glance. Her focus was entirely on the stage, on the future. That single act of ignoring him was more devastating than any verbal retort she could ever have conceived. It relegated him to the periphery of her world, an obstacle already overcome, a detail already forgotten. She ascended the small set of stairs to the stage and shook Alistair Finch's outstretched hand. He gave her a paternal, approving nod. "The stage is yours, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Catherine stepped up to the podium, the same podium from which Nathaniel had mocked her very existence just 30 minutes earlier. The applause died down, and a new, more profound silence fell, one of rapt attention. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze calm and commanding. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she began, her voice crisp and clear, carrying to every corner of the vast hall without a tremor. "Thank you to the board of Ethelred Global for your trust and for this incredible opportunity." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Mr. Finch is correct. The future requires a new way of thinking. It requires a commitment not to fleeting praise, but to sustainable, long-term value. It demands integrity in our operations, accountability in our leadership, and a relentless pursuit of excellence in our products." Her speech was a masterclass in corporate precision. It was devoid of emotion, yet it was the most powerful statement of the night. She didn't mention her past. She didn't allude to Nathaniel's speech. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke about accountability and integrity was an indirect, devastating indictment of him. The Ethelred Tech division will be built on a foundation of strategic clarity and operational discipline, she continued. We will empower our innovators, we will streamline our processes, and we will unlock the immense untapped potential within our portfolio. Our work begins on Monday. I expect to meet with the heads of every subsidiary in the coming days to outline the path forward. She looked directly toward the front tables, where the heads of the various tech companies, including Nathaniel, were seated. Her message was unambiguous. You will answer to me. Thank you. She concluded her speech, lasting less than 2 minutes. It was all she needed. She stepped back from the podium as another wave of applause, this one genuine and thunderous, filled the room. Alistair Finch stood beside her, beaming. A photographer's flashbulb went off, capturing the image that would be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The next morning, Catherine Vance, the new CEO, poised and powerful at the podium, and in the blurred, out-of-focus background, the ghost-white, shattered face of her ex-husband, Nathaniel Sterling. The king was dead. Long live the queen. The moment Catherine stepped down from the stage, the carefully constructed social order of the gala shattered. The gravitational center of the room shifted instantly and violently. A swarm of people, executives, investors, journalists, and former fence-sitters surged towards her, their faces alight with newfound admiration. Hands were extended, business cards were proffered, and voices buzzed with urgent congratulations. An incredible move, Ms. Vance. A brilliant strategy. So, but my team would love to get 30 minutes on your calendar next week. Catherine handled the onslaught with the same unshakable poise she had displayed all evening, accepting the congratulations with cool professionalism. She was no longer just Catherine. She was Ms. Vance, the most powerful new executive in the industry. Meanwhile, at the front table, a circle of emptiness formed around Nathaniel Sterling. It was as if he had become radioactive. His sycophants, who had been laughing at his jokes minutes earlier, now avoided his gaze, suddenly fascinated by their dessert forks or the architectural details of the ceiling. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water, and they were swimming away from the wounded. Brielle, who had built her identity around being attached to a winner, looked at him with a dawning, horrified realization. The man she had adored for his power and status was now publicly neutered. His currency was gone. She slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid her hand off his arm. The gesture was small, but the finality of it was absolute. Nathaniel sat frozen, his mind a chaotic vortex of rage, humiliation, and sheer panic. CEO of the Ethelred Tech division. It meant she wasn't just successful. It meant she was his boss. The woman whose ideas he had stolen, whose ambition he had ridiculed, whose very existence he had tried to erase, would now control his budget, his strategy, his future. The Innovator of the Year trophy on his table felt like a tombstone. He had to say something. He had to do something. Fueled by a desperate shredding of his ego, he stood up and started to move through the crowd towards Catherine. He pushed past a vice president and an analyst, his eyes locked on her. She was finishing a conversation with a senior banker when she saw him approaching. Her circle of new admirers parted, sensing a final dramatic confrontation. The ambient noise of the room seemed to fade away. "Catherine!" He hissed, his voice a choked whisper. He reached out his hand, about to touch her arm. She took a half step back, just enough to make his gesture pathetic and desperate. Her expression was not angry, not triumphant, not even pitying. It was neutral. It was the face a superior shows to a subordinate who is out of line. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and level, yet carrying the chill of an Arctic wind. The use of his formal surname was a deliberate, brutal power play. In that moment, she stripped away every vestige of their shared history, leaving only their new, starkly defined professional relationship. She checked the delicate watch on her wrist. The celebration appears to be winding down. I have a great deal to prepare for over the weekend. She met his stunned, furious gaze. We will speak on Monday. Please have your divisions complete Q3 performance, analysis burn rate projections, and a detailed staffing report on my desk by 9:00 a.m. sharp. I'll be scheduling your formal performance review shortly thereafter. She held his gaze for one more second, letting the cold, hard reality of his new circumstances sink in. Then, without another word, she turned her back on him and walked away, Alistair Finch falling into step beside her. Nathaniel Sterling was left standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, the crowd parting around him as if he were a leper. The sound of their whispers and the flash of a phone camera, capturing his utter desolation, were the only sounds he could hear. He had sought to humiliate her in a room full of their peers, to make her small so he could feel big. Instead, he had orchestrated his own spectacular public demolition. Catherine didn't look back. As she walked through the grand lobby and out into the cool New York night, she felt no giddy rush of victory, no petty thrill of revenge. She felt something deeper, more profound. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of a meticulously executed plan. It was the feeling of her own worth reclaimed, not by luck or fate, but by her own intellect, resilience, and unwavering belief in herself. The past was finally where it belonged behind her. Before her lay an empire waiting to be commanded. The digital clock on the bedside table read 4:30 a.m. Outside Catherine's apartment, the New York City sky was still a deep, inky black, punctuated by the distant, sleepless lights of other towers. For most of her life, waking at this hour would have been a symptom of anxiety, a mind too restless to stay quiet. But this morning, as she opened her eyes before the alarm, there was no anxiety. There was only a profound and potent stillness, a clarity of purpose that felt as solid and real as the bed she lay in. The victory at the gala felt a lifetime away. It had been the thunderclap. Today was when the storm itself would make landfall. She moved through her morning routine with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark. A 20-minute session on her yoga mat, not for exercise, but for centering. A simple breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee consumed while reviewing a data summary on her tablet. A preliminary dive into the operational metrics of the 6 subsidiaries that now fell under her command. Her mind was already at work, identifying patterns, flagging anomalies, and constructing the chess moves for the day, the week, the quarter. Choosing her attire was a strategic decision. She bypassed the severe, dark pantsuits that were the unofficial uniform of many female executives trying to project authority in a man's world. Instead, she selected a cream-colored sheath dress with clean architectural lines paired with a sharply tailored blazer in a muted slate blue. The ensemble was feminine, but formidable, communicating confidence without resorting to cliché. It was the armor of a woman who had no need to imitate masculine power because she was busy defining her own. As she fastened a simple silver watch around her wrist, the only piece of jewelry she wore, she caught her reflection. The woman looking back was not the ghost of Nathaniel Sterling's past. She was not the wounded wife or the struggling entrepreneur. She was the CEO of the Ethelred Tech division. The title felt less like a prize and more like a mantle of immense responsibility. Alistair Finch hadn't just given her a job. He had placed a billion-dollar portfolio in her hands and trusted her to perform surgery on it. The personal history with Nathaniel was the catalyst, but the professional task at hand was now 1,000 times larger. The thought was sobering but exhilarating. Across town, in a penthouse apartment that felt more like a sterile art gallery than a home, Nathaniel Sterling was also awake. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night pacing the vast, cold marble floors, a glass of ludicrously expensive scotch in his hand, the Innovator of the Year award, sitting on his bar like a golden skull. The hours after the gala had been a cascade of humiliations. Brielle had vanished before dessert was even cleared, leaving behind only a text message that was as brief as it was brutal. "I think it's best we take a break. This is all too much." His phone, which usually buzzed with fawning messages after a public appearance, had been eerily silent, save for a few terse formal emails from Ethelred's legal and HR departments, outlining the reporting structure changes. Rage had been the first stage. A volcanic, consuming fury at Catherine, at Finch, at the universe itself for this betrayal. How dare they? After everything he had built, then came the frantic search for an escape route. He'd considered calling his contacts on the Ethelred board men he had schmoozed with on golf courses and at cocktail parties, but he knew with a sickening certainty that they would never cross Alistair Finch. Finch's power was absolute. Any appeal would be seen as weakness in subordination. He was trapped. Now, in the grey light of dawn, the rage and panic had curdled into something far worse, a cold, gnawing dread. The 9 a.m. deadline, the reports she had demanded, the very act of compiling them was an exercise in ritual submission. He, Nathaniel Sterling, the visionary, the rainmaker, had to package his own company's data like a junior analyst and hand-deliver it to the woman he had publicly scorned. He sat at his sleek, minimalist desk, the laptop screen glaring at him. He pulled up the financials, the staffing charts, the R&D burn rates. These were numbers he usually glossed over, leaving the tedious details to his CFO, while he focused on crafting the narrative selling the dream. But now looking at them, through Catherine's eyes, the eyes of a forensic strategist, he saw the vulnerabilities he had ignored. He saw the bloated budget for Project Nightingale, a speculative AI venture that was his personal pet project, staffed with expensive visionaries who had produced nothing but buzzwords for 2 years. He saw the declining margins on their core products, masked by aggressive marketing spends. The data didn't lie. His kingdom was a house of cards, and Catherine was the one who knew exactly which card to pull to make it all collapse. His hands, usually so steady when signing 9-figure deals, trembled slightly as he dragged the files into a single folder, labeling it Q3 Analysis, Momentum Dynamics. The simple act felt like signing his own death warrant. Catherine arrived at the Ethelred Tower at precisely 7:30 a.m. The morning shift of security guards, who had seen her coming and going for months as an anonymous consultant, now snapped to attention. The head of security, a burly man named Frank, stepped forward. "Good morning, Ms. Vance. Welcome." The deference was new, and it followed her across the polished granite floor of the lobby. Whispers trailed in her wake as employees recognized her from the news alerts that had blasted across the business world over the weekend. Her new office was on the 48th floor. It was a corner suite, vast and impersonal, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panorama of the city. The furniture was heavy dark mahogany, the relic of her predecessor, a man named Arthur Kensington, who had been gently but firmly pushed into retirement. The air was stale with the scent of old power. Catherine walked to the window, placing her hand on the cool glass. She wasn't admiring the view. She was assessing her territory. From here, she could see the distant office buildings that housed her subsidiaries. Her empire, an empire in disarray. Her new executive assistant, a man in his late 50s named Robert Connolly, arrived at 7:45. He was a veteran of the 48th floor, having served Mr. Kensington for over a decade. He was visibly nervous, holding a slim portfolio, unsure of what to expect from this new, unexpected leader. "Good morning, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a little tight. "I'm Robert Connolly. I've taken the liberty of preparing your schedule for the week based on Mr. Finch's transition notes. It's, of course, entirely flexible." "Thank you, Robert," Catherine said, turning from the window. She gave him a small, genuine smile that seemed to put him slightly at ease. "I appreciate you coming in early. First, please arrange for a design consultant to be here tomorrow. This office needs a complete overhaul. I want it to be a functional, collaborative workspace, not a museum. Glasslight modern. Get rid of all of this. She gestured to the heavy furniture. Robert blinked, surprised by the swiftness of her decision-making. Yes, of course, Miss Vance. Second, she continued, her tone all business. Please clear my schedule this morning until 10:00 a.m. I am expecting a meeting at 9. After that, please set up 1-hour introductory meetings with the heads of the other 5 subsidiaries starting this afternoon, and connect with IT. I want a direct, real-time data feed from every subsidiary's financial and operational dashboard integrated into my system by end of day. Yes, Ms. Vance, Robert said, scribbling furiously in his notepad. His nervousness was being replaced by a sense of professional respect. This was a leader who knew exactly what she wanted. That will be all for now, thank you, Robert. He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Catherine sat down at the enormous mahogany desk. She didn't open her computer. She simply waited. The clock on the wall ticked with quiet, methodical purpose. 8:50, 8:55, 8:58. At exactly 8:59 a.m., there was a sharp knock on her door. Come in, she said, her voice even. The door opened and Nathaniel Sterling walked in. He was dressed in one of his signature bespoke suits, a uniform of defiance. But his face was pale and drawn, the skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones. He clutched a slim silver laptop and a leather-bound folder. He strode to her desk and placed the folder on its polished surface with a thud that was just a little too loud, a petty act of aggression. The reports you requested, he said, his voice clipped. Catherine didn't look at the folder. She gestured to the chair opposite her. Please sit down, Mr. Sterling. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, sinking into the leather chair. The vast desk between them felt like a battlefield. Thank you for being punctual. She began, her tone maddeningly neutral. She swiveled her monitor slightly toward him. I already have the raw data, of course, pulled from the Ethelred mainframe this morning. I was simply interested to see how you would package it. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She had already seen everything. This wasn't a briefing, it was a cross-examination. She opened her own file and a series of charts and graphs filled the screen. Let's start with Project Nightingale, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Your report describes it as a long-term strategic investment in next-generation AI. My data shows an 18-month expenditure of $42 million with no product milestones, met no IP filed, and a staff turnover of 60%. Can you explain the strategic justification for continuing to fund a project that is by every measurable metric a failure? He was ready for this. He leaned forward, summoning his old charisma. Catherine, Ms. Vance, you have to understand, true disruption doesn't follow a tidy spreadsheet. We're attracting the best minds in the field. It's about fostering a culture of innovation. You can't put a price on that. I can actually, she countered, pointing to a different graph. The price is a 30% budget overrun for the entire R&D department, which has directly led to a 9-month delay on the 2.0 update for our core product, Momentum OS, the single largest revenue generator in your portfolio. Your culture of innovation is cannibalizing the product that pays for it. That isn't innovation, Mr. Sterling. That is mismanagement. He recoiled as if struck. She was using his own business school lexicon against him, but with a precision he could never muster. Let's move on to staffing, she said, clicking to a new screen. Momentum Dynamics has the highest ratio of marketing and administrative staff to engineers of any subsidiary in the division. Why does your personal executive office require a staff of 6, including a brand strategist? My brand is crucial to the company's public perception, he retorted, his voice rising. The company's perception should be built on the quality of its products, not the cult of personality of its CEO, she replied calmly. Your travel and entertainment budget for the last quarter alone could have funded the entire starting salary of a new junior engineering team. She went on a surgeon, dissecting a diseased patient. She dismantled his arguments one by one, not with emotion or personal attacks, but with cold, irrefutable data. The charisma he had relied on his entire life was useless against the wall of her logic. He tried to bluster to deflect to charm, but each attempt was met with a quiet, factual rebuttal that left him exposed and foolish. The showman was being systematically disarmed by the strategist. He felt the sweat prickle on his brow. The power, the control, the very air in the room belonged to her. Finally, after 20 minutes of this clinical demolition, she leaned back in her chair. The picture this data paints, Mr. Sterling, is not of a thriving, innovative company. It's of a bloated, undisciplined entity, dangerously dependent on its founder's reputation and headed for a severe contraction if market conditions shift even slightly. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He was beaten. She let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. I am not going to fire you. That would be disruptive. For now. The implied threat was clear. Instead, you have a new mandate. You have 90 days to deliver a complete strategic realignment plan for momentum dynamics. It will include a 50% budget cut for all non-revenue generating projects, including the immediate termination of Project Nightingale. It will include a staff reduction of no less than 15%, focused on administrative and marketing overhead. And it will outline a clear metrics-based path to doubling your operating margin within 18 months. Your discretionary budget is frozen effective immediately, pending my approval of that plan. You will provide me with a written progress report every Friday by 5:00 p.m., and we will meet every Monday morning at this time to review it. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You built this company, Mr. Sterling. Now you will learn how to run it responsibly, under my supervision. She swiveled her monitor back to face her. That will be all. You may go. Nathaniel stood up on shaky legs. The arrogance, the defiance, the rage, it had all been burned away, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated man. He turned without a word and walked toward the door. The clicks of his expensive shoes on the hardwood floor sounded small and pathetic in the vast office. As he walked down this corridor of the 48th floor, he felt the eyes of the other executives and assistants on him. They knew. They could see it on his face. He was no longer the king. He was just another subordinate walking away from a dressing down from the new boss. Back in her office, Catherine watched the door close. She didn't feel a surge of triumph. She didn't savor his defeat. She simply took a single deep breath, the first she felt she'd taken all morning. The weight on her shoulders settled immense and real. She had won the first battle, but the war for Ethelred Tech had just begun. She looked out at the sprawling city, at the empire she now commanded. Then she turned back to her desk, picked up the phone to call Robert, and began the work of her new day. There was no time to waste, looking back. That night wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. Catherine Vance didn't just reclaim her dignity. She reclaimed the narrative that had been stolen from her, proving that true power isn't loud, arrogant, or dismissive. It's strategic, intelligent, and patient. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is not determined by someone else's opinion, especially the opinion of those who try to diminish you to elevate themselves. The ultimate victory lies not in stooping to their level, but in rising so far above it that they become an insignificant speck in your past. What would you have done in Catherine's position? How would you have handled that moment of public humiliation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience and ultimate triumph resonated with you, show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible stories where the underestimated rise and redefine success.